There we go. So I'm Karen Maher. I'm the Director of Anti-Trafficking Initiatives for the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking, or as we like to call it, ICESA-HT. It's a lot of letters when we try to explain it to people. So it's a little bit easier to remember it that way. I'm really excited to be doing this for you all, even though this is healthcare specific. There's definitely pieces that we'll talk about other roles and what that looks like. And for those of you who are on a SART, we just created a 2-part training series specific to SARTs. And so if you're interested in that, definitely follow up with me after this. Let me just see if I can minimize on the screen there. There we go. Okay, so a little bit about the coalition. If you are not familiar with us, we empower Indiana communities to prevent sexual assault and human trafficking and serve those impacted by it. 2 of the biggest things we do is provide training and technical assistance and support to rape crisis centers throughout the state, as well as sexual assault response teams. We do public education on sexual assault and human trafficking, including a couple of different primary prevention curriculums. We engage with state legislators. So when issues come up that affect survivors of sexual assault and human trafficking, or those who serve them, we do advocacy around that. The new abortion law would be an example of that. We promote and advocate for the expansion of services, and we assist in building capacities for communities to address sexual assault and human trafficking. And so we're really building the foundation and structure in the state of Indiana to address these issues and filling in the gaps and kind of coming alongside those who are doing the direct service work to make sure they have as much support as possible. So a little bit about me. I am a licensed attorney and I have been doing public service work for over 20 years now. I never like to say that out loud, only because it makes me feel old at this point. But 8 of those years have been in the anti-trafficking field. And so I've had a number of roles over the years. I've been an attorney representing children in abuse and neglect proceedings. I've represented adults on adult guardianship cases. I've been a hotline attorney for legal aid, working with adults in crisis on a variety of legal issues. I've been a regional coalition coordinator with the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, which I'll be talking about a little later in the presentation as a really great resource for you all. And I've also been a consultant for them on systems collaboration. So done a lot of different pieces and parts over the years, which has given me a really unique perspective on human trafficking and those who are impacted by it. One of the biggest things I do in my current role is coordinate IPATH, which is our state human trafficking task force. Sorry, my slides are jumping around without me. So we'll definitely be talking about IPATH towards the end of the presentation as well, so you can get some more information on that. But I'm very passionate in connecting people, not just doing training, but connecting people who are doing the work from different backgrounds to help people get on the same page and maximize everybody's efforts to benefit the populations that we serve. So the reason that I am always excited to be doing training for healthcare providers is because the reality is the majority of human trafficking survivors come into contact with a healthcare provider while they're actively being trafficked. One of the most recent studies showed that it was 88% of human trafficking survivors, which obviously is a huge number. The downside in that study was that only 6% of them were actually identified during the provision of healthcare. And so really important that you all know what human trafficking looks like, be able to identify it and know how to follow up in those cases. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is run by the Polaris Project, takes hotline calls from all 50 states on suspected cases of human trafficking. And then every couple of years, they put their statistics out to kind of show a breakdown of trends they're seeing around the country, numbers of cases, whether it's sex trafficking, labor trafficking. But one of the things they found in 2017 was that healthcare, accessing to healthcare services was one of the top 3 ways that a survivor accessed potential help. So again, we are seeing some change now that there's education across the country and more identification being made. But I think we still probably have a long way to go. And, when we consider total numbers of survivors, I think in 2020, which is the latest year that they put out the hotline numbers, there was over 10,000 cases across the US. And you can see, these numbers for accessing help barely scratch the surface of that. Really quick, before we get into the heart of the presentation, I want to talk for a minute about the terms victim and survivor. I actually got a call from a colleague of mine who is in the healthcare field not too long ago, who does a lot of education in her own facility on human trafficking. And she said, I know we see both terms used interchangeably, and as we're thinking about this best practices, which one should we be using at this point? And so my answer was kind of a long one, because generally speaking, survivor is the word that we prefer in this field. It's an empowerment and strength-based term, because it recognizes the person went through very difficult circumstances and has survived that through a lot of strength. However, you'll hear me use the term victim a lot in this presentation as well, because if we're talking about somebody who has not been identified yet and we're looking at either federal or state law, that has legal meaning. And this is true within healthcare codes as well, which I'll share at the end of the presentation, as well as whether it's a call to DCS. So, that victim term really we use it mainly for identification and legal purposes. Survivor is more general to providing services to somebody who has been through exploitation. All right, so our objectives today, we're going to be looking at federal and state law and how they define human trafficking. We're going to talk about the dynamics of trafficking and why victims don't self-identify or reach out for help. We'll be talking about what trauma-informed care looks like in the context of healthcare provision for victims and service providers, and why it's so important. And we'll be identifying local and state resources. All right, so federal law, the statute that covers human trafficking under federal law is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It came out in 2000, and you can see it's been reauthorized a number of times over the years, and they've expanded it and add different pieces and parts over time. But the definition of sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting somebody for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which the act was induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or the person induced to perform the act was under 18. So basically what all of that means, if somebody is an adult and they're involved in commercial sex, there has to be that force, fraud, or coercion piece by a third party for it to be sex trafficking. If we are talking about a minor involved in commercial sex, they are automatically considered a human trafficking victim under federal law. That force, fraud, or coercion does not need to be proven. It very well may be present, but it doesn't have to be proven when we're talking about a minor. And just a note, when I say commercial sex, I'm talking about the exchange of sex for anything of value. We traditionally think of, an exchange of sex for money. It can be money, but it could also be the exchange of sex for food, clothes, shelter for somebody who's homeless, even the exchange of sex for drugs. And unfortunately, that's pretty common in what we see across the state of Indiana. With respect to labor trafficking, you see a lot of those those same pieces, the recruitment, harboring, transporting, provision, or obtaining somebody for labor or services, again, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And those elements do have to be proven in both cases of adults and minors. Okay, and for some reason, it's not letting, oh, there we go. So, you know, to make it a little bit easier to figure out all of those pieces instead of just looking at the definitions, Polaris Project created this, what they call the AMP model. So you have to have one of these actions by one of these means for one of these purposes. And so I'm not going to read the list to you, but you can see the breakdown there. And the reason I have the means highlighted is just a reminder that for adults, those pieces have to be proven. For minors, they do not. And then a lot of words on this slide. And so I'm going to try and break this down and simplify it a little bit. When we're talking about coercion under federal law, basically that involves threats of serious harm or any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the person to believe their failure to perform an act or service would result in serious harm. And in talking about the serious harm piece, we look at it through the eyes of the person who is being trafficked and how that would look to somebody in the same background and circumstances. So that's really important because originally it was just a reasonable person and what it looked like to a reasonable person. But what's reasonable to you and I can look very different to what's reasonable to somebody who has no place to stay or no means of getting food, or they have an addiction. And so the federal law was changed to make it a reasonable person of the same background and the same circumstances. Okay, so looking at Indiana law, we have 5 criminal offenses. And a lot of the language in them is similar to federal law, just broken down into these different pieces and parts. So you have that promotion of human labor trafficking, promotion of human sexual trafficking, and then 2 specific to children, which is the promotion of child sexual trafficking. That's really that harboring, transporting, recruiting piece. Child sexual trafficking is actually selling a child or prostituting them. And then human trafficking is applicable to buyers, so the purchasers of commercial sex. And rather than kind of show you the actual statutes and have everybody read that, because that's not necessarily the most helpful thing, I kind of broke down the most important pieces. So really important, minors cannot be arrested for prostitution. It wasn't that long ago in Indiana that they could. I think they changed that in maybe 2017-ish. So at this point, only adults can be arrested for prostitution. And just to be clear, when we talk about prostitution, that does involve commercial sex, but that is when an adult is involved in commercial sex and there's no third party using force, fraud, or coercion to induce them into it. Again, the threat of force, fraud, or coercion doesn't need to be proven when a minor is trafficked for commercial sex. It's not a defense to promotion of child sexual trafficking that a minor consented to participate in prostitution or sexual conduct. It's very common when victims are recovered, and we'll get into this a little bit later. They don't self-identify as a victim. You know, maybe they believe they're in love with the trafficker, and they'll say things like, I was okay with that. He asked me to do it. I wanted to do it for him. I love him. You know, as crazy as that may sound to you or I, that they're definitely in a mindset where that's how what they believe at that time. And so even if they say I consented or I was okay with that, it's not a defense when we're talking about a minor. And then finally, buyers can be charged with human trafficking, whether or not they knew the individual they purchased was a human trafficking victim. Okay, so Indiana law actually gives a whole list of what force, threat of force, coercion, or fraud looks like is not limited to this list, but includes these. So causing or threatening to cause harm, physically restraining them, abusing or threatening to abuse the law or legal process, knowingly destroying, concealing, removing, their passport, their identification paperwork. And then that last one I think is really interesting, facilitating or controlling a human trafficking victim's access to a controlled substance. This is very common in cases where there's an overlap with substance abuse and trafficking. It may start out where the trafficker is a person's dealer, and it's at the point that they have this person hooked that they'll say, I'm not providing you another fix until you bring me some extra money, and you have to do that by having sex with people and meeting this quota. And so in that way, the person's already hooked, they have this addiction, and it's a means of manipulating them and controlling them. And we'll kind of refer back to this piece when we think about why victims don't self-identify, why they don't reach out for help, and some of the biases we may have when we see them. So when we're talking about data on human trafficking, it's a crime that's really hard to collect numbers on for a variety of reasons. It happens in the dark. Victims, again, usually don't self-identify or reach out for help. And, particularly if we're talking about adults, there's no mandatory reporting. So we, kind of look at numbers from the National Human Trafficking Hotline as a baseline. So you can see I pulled the last 2 years that they put out numbers for. And in 2019, there were 157 cases of human trafficking reported from Indiana, which was a 19% increase from the prior year. And then in 2020, 140 cases were reported to the hotline from Indiana. You may be thinking those are a lot of cases. To me, they actually look low because we know there's more than that. There's no unified state database in Indiana, but there are a couple of places for collecting some numbers. So the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program is a statewide program where they contract with service providers to provide direct services to youth up to 24. And I'm sorry that I have not stopped this from jumping around, youth up to 24. And so, when the service provider does provide a service, they put that data in to the database. And so they have a means of collecting some numbers. And so since that program was started in 2015, up until present, I think they are probably over 800, and I think I'm estimating on the low side, over 800 youth who have been either trafficked, sexually exploited, or found to be at high risk. DCS has just started collecting some numbers, and so probably in the near future, we'll see, some data from them. And then in Indiana, we actually just put out a new state law that went into effect on July 1st of this year, requiring that they report all human trafficking investigations to the Attorney General's office. And so that's kind of another means of data collection. But the bottom line is that when we look at numbers from the national hotline, this is really just scratching the surface. Just anecdotally, I can tell you, since I started in my current role at ICASA HT, I have been receiving calls from around the state for assistance with adult survivors. And I think I'm up to about 11 or 12 calls just in the past 2 months. So, and they have been pretty steady. So there are likely a lot more than what we know of at this point. All right, really important to understand that at its core, human trafficking is the exploitation of somebody with a vulnerability. Traffickers prey on people that have unmet needs. So that can look like a variety of other societal issues, domestic violence, lack of resources, recent immigration, substance abuse, mental health issues, sexual assault. As people are struggling with these different things, it's really easy for a trafficker to kind of target, okay, who, doesn't have a place to stay, who's homeless and, is really desperate for a place to live. Or, maybe it's youth who have been through the foster care system and feel like nobody loves them. And, it's really easy to kind of prey on them and say, oh, you're beautiful. I, get, kind of groom them and then I love you. I want to be with you forever. It really kind of pulls people in that way who are struggling. So you can see for vulnerable populations, personal or family history of substance abuse, physical or sexual abuse or violence, runaway or homeless youth. This is hugely vulnerable demographic. Youth in the child welfare system, same thing. There's a number of studies out there that have shown anywhere from, I think, 50% to 98% in one state of recovered victims had some contact with the child welfare system in their background. LGBTQ individuals with lack of support, that personal or family history of mental illness, recent migration. We've heard a lot of talk about people coming over the southern border or coming from other countries. And we'll get into a little more specifics on that in a moment. Individuals with disabilities, lack of resources, and then finally, history of being trafficked as a minor. I think this one is really important to think about because a lot of times in this field, we tend to talk about either child victims, youth victims, or adults as if they're two completely separate species, right? But you're really talking about people on an age continuum. And so very often somebody who's been trafficked over a long period of time as a minor, if they've not been recovered and exited that life, they are trafficked into adulthood. Or it may be the only type of lifestyle that they know. They don't know anything else. They don't have any other support network. And so, I always say it's not like somebody is a trafficking victim on their 17th birthday experiencing exploitation, and then suddenly they become a prostitute on their 18th birthday. That exploitation really continues through to adulthood. Right. Barriers to identification and engagement. So when you look at the things on this list, these are the ones that, I would classify as barriers created by the trafficker through coercion and manipulation and control. So that first one, trafficker has a strong psychological hold on the victim. Very often we see that in cases where the victim has been groomed to believe they're in a relationship with the trafficker, and the trafficker has told them they love them. And, over time, there's this intermittent, maybe giving them gifts and then abusing them, giving them compliments and then, exploiting them. And so that actually creates, studies have found a biological response in their brain. And it's very similar to Stockholm syndrome, where they become bonded with the trafficker. They think and if you ask them, and maybe you say to them, I think that person's exploiting you. It's not going to go anywhere. They will probably say, I don't know what you're talking about. That's my boyfriend. I love him. So really important to be aware of that one. They've trusted someone who's lied to them, may have nowhere else to go. And you're kind of seeing all these vulnerabilities that we've talked about from all those different societal issues. May have been lied to about the job that they were going to do. This is very common in labor trafficking. When folks are brought from another country, they're told, you're going to do this one type of job, and it really is something completely different that they don't get paid for. And there's a lot of abuse in the background. isolation. They're embarrassed about what's happening to them. It's very common for them to feel shame. And the tricky part is the trafficker is in the background, absolutely telling them, you're worthless. You made this choice to do this. You've done this criminal act. Now you're a criminal. If the police are going to arrest anybody, it's you, not me. And unfortunately, it actually plays out that way sometimes. Very often they're coerced to commit other crimes within the context of being trafficked. And so maybe they're arrested for battery or, a drug offense, theft. It can look like a whole variety of things, but the bottom line is the victim then, when that happens to them, because law enforcement doesn't understand there might be other things going on in the background, the victim thinks, well, my trafficker or my pimp, my boyfriend, however they view them, they were right. They said this would happen to me, and that's actually what happened to me. They do know what they're talking about. I can't trust law enforcement. This one is always hard, I think, for people. The one about current exploitive situation is better than the one that they came from. When you think about what trafficking really is and the violence, and in sex trafficking, it's common for the victim to be forced to see 10 to 15 buyers a night, excuse me, to meet a quota. They have to bring home a certain amount of money to the trafficker. They're being threatened that they're going to be killed. They're being beaten, just a whole variety of things. It's hard to imagine, if you haven't been through that, how that could actually be better than where they came from. But for a lot of victims, again, thinking about those vulnerabilities that were underlying, you may have had a young person who was sexually abused by multiple family members throughout growing up, or maybe was homeless and hungry, had, slept on the streets, had no food for days. And those were awful situations. And so to them, in their mind, even though we know it's not a healthy or good situation, they feel like it's actually better because in some ways they're getting their needs met. And then finally, they can't see a way out, or the threats or danger to family back home. Oh, excuse me. All right, so I'm sure most of you recognize the power and control wheel from domestic violence. This has been around for a number of years now. Polaris Project converted this in 2010 to use it in human trafficking cases, because there's a lot of the same pieces going on in the background in terms of the coercion, the threats, the intimidation. You know what? I'm obviously going to have to figure out how to fix this the next time I do a presentation with the slide jumping around. So denying, blaming, minimizing, isolation, physical abuse. One that they don't have on here, but I think it's worth mentioning, is normalization. If you get a chance to go to a training with the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, they show a video with a survivor kind of talking about what things look like day to day for her when she was being exploited, and how it almost felt normalized because, there were other women being exploited with her, and, they would go to these situations where there's a number of adults and buyers, unfortunately, because they have money, can come from, they can be lawyers, doctors, upstanding, what we see on the outside as upstanding community members, but are actually purchasing sex with a trafficking victim. And when they're, as a young person, especially if they're seeing all of these adults involved, adults that should help and don't, to them, it almost becomes, well, this must be a normal thing. Like, they can feel that it's off, but they're not being exposed to anything else but that world. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the barrier of biases, because we don't really think about this one very often. Sometimes we're not identifying victims because we have biases and we're making assumptions about a person and completely thinking, that the red flags are getting past us because we're thinking something else. So one of the most common ones would be looking at somebody as a prostitute if they're involved in commercial sex, thinking this was, their choice. They want to be doing this. They picked that lifestyle. And that is true in some cases, but not all. There's a great deal of individuals where it wasn't their choice. And kind of looking at everyone in commercial sex as a prostitute really looks at them as a criminal, right? Because prostitution is a crime under our state law. And so once you go down that road of thinking prostitute, they're a criminal, you're not looking at them as a victim. And you may have very different assumptions about, what's going on behind the scenes. The reality is this one study, and I would venture to guess it's actually higher, but found 50% of first-time arrestees for prostitution actually met the federal definition of human trafficking. Some of this, can be due to the fact that, law enforcement needs more training. If they haven't had a whole lot of training around human trafficking to understand what that looks like. Some of it, again, is that difficult piece with adults because you have to prove the force, fraud, or coercion, not knowing, if you don't know the other pieces, you might fall back on, well, that's just prostitution. So drug addict is another one. If you're seeing, let me go back. All right, so you're seeing one of those folks who maybe is considered a frequent flyer in the hospital, or, if you're law enforcement and you're encountering them on the street who is high all the time, they're disheveled, they're behaving erratically, and you're thinking, okay, this is just somebody who, and obviously if somebody has a drug addiction, that's still somebody who needs help, right? But we may not be thinking about what got them there. And what's going on in the background. So this one wide-ranging study that did a number of interviews with survivors found that 84.3% used alcohol, drugs, or both during their captivity, and more than a quarter were forced to use during their trafficking experience. That 84.3% actually makes a lot of sense because if you think about the violence they're enduring, having to have sex with strangers, with multiple strangers on a nightly basis, maybe being from another country, not knowing where you are and feeling shame because of your culture, of what's happening to you. It's basically a way of self-medicating. I've heard survivors say that, they couldn't get through that experience being in their right mind. And so they actually had to take something to get through that. And then being forced by the trafficker. So, if it's not a situation where it's the dealer getting them hooked and then exploiting them, it's the trafficker who is using it as a means of control. So it could be giving them something to keep them awake all night so that they're working throughout the night, or, something to just keep them compliant. But, for a variety of reasons, we see that heavy overlap between substance abuse and human trafficking. And then illegal immigrant is one last one. Again, a lot of stuff in the media right now about, people coming in over the border and folks do come into the country through, illegal means. And so I recognize that is a thing. But the reality, when we're talking about human trafficking victims, there's been multiple studies that have found, and this one in particular found 71% of victims held some type of visa status when they entered the US. They were actually legal when they came here. Most of the time it's somebody here who's helping arrange for them to get status. Maybe it's a work visa and it's a fraudulent they fraudulently advertised what the job would be, but they helped them get a work visa to come in. And then it wasn't until the person got here and the trafficker took the visa and held on to it along with any other identification paperwork that the person fell out of status. That in those circumstances, that is a very common means of control that somebody uses over the victim, because when you think about it, once they get here, if somebody takes their identification and their visa, they have no way of showing who they are or that they are here illegally. And then, of course, the trafficker also says, if you don't do what I tell you, you're going to be thrown in jail by the police, or deported. And they don't know what their rights are. And so they go along with what they're told to do. I think I'm going to skip this quote because I have a video a little further along that kind of encompasses that. So I'm just going to stop here for a second. Let me enlarge the panel. So at this point, I want to take a little bit of a pause before we get into the trauma-informed care piece to just get a sense of where everyone is at in terms of thinking about the information that was presented so far. And I want to ask the question, have you seen cases, maybe you've already had cases that have been identified, but are you thinking of any other cases you've come across from this information that you're thinking maybe now that could potentially have been trafficking, whether you're law enforcement, healthcare, whoever? And there's no wrong answer to this. And you can just put that in the chat if you want. And Marissa, I'm going to let you check the chat for me since I can't pull it up at the moment. And while you're thinking about that, I will tell you, when I started out as an attorney, again, this is going to age me a little bit, but it was actually before the Trafficking Victims Protection Act went into effect. So at that point, we didn't even have federal law in human trafficking. And even when it did go into effect, no one was really doing training on it at that point. It really hasn't been until maybe the past 5-6 years that there's been a serious training effort across the country on this issue. And so thinking about cases that I had as an attorney, I can look back now that I'm educated in this field and think, wow, I know that I saw it in a number of cases. I think this client, that client, I definitely missed it with that client. And it's a hard realization, but then over the years doing this work, I have learned to give myself grace on that, because, I always tell people, you don't know something until you know it, right? If you haven't had the training, if no one's talked about trafficking before and you haven't been given any understanding of it, it's understandable that you would miss it. Don't see any in the chat. Any thoughts at all on that as you're thinking that through? And I'll give you another minute to think about that. I know I've talked to, law enforcement, DCS workers, prosecutors, just a whole variety of folks after I've done trainings who will come up to me and say, yeah, I didn't know that I think this one particular case I had was actually trafficking, and I didn't realize it. Shanna, I'm sure that we have missed some in the ED. Yeah. Yeah, and I guarantee that's common in EDs across the country. Megan, I feel certain I probably have related to the population that is seen in emergency services, but there's not a specific case. Yeah, that's a really good point. So many addicted or vulnerable populations. And I recognize, for those of you who are first responders, whether it's, law enforcement, fire and EMS, healthcare providers in the emergency department, you are bombarded with crises every day, and in the moment, just kind of trying to put out all the fires and get through those. And so, it's very hard to kind of take a minute and think about, okay, what's going on in the background. So I absolutely recognize it. I do think for first responders, it can be a really tricky issue, and you're definitely seeing all those vulnerable populations for sure. And so, you're kind of in the immediate of, let me make sure the immediate injury or safety or need is met. And then kind of having to move on. And hopefully, if nothing else, this training, once you think it through, will give you some additional resources. So if you think maybe you're seeing it, or, just kind of rings a bell on a particular case, you can then know, all right, there's some people I can reach out to for this if I have questions or I need additional help. Okay, so thank you for that. We're going to move on. All right, so the importance of trauma-informed care, and actually I'm going to pop back on here for a minute. I do want to ask, have any of you folks on the call individually or through your organizations had trauma-informed care training? I'm guessing yes, since it's pretty prevalent now, but feel free to let me know if you haven't. Just a quick yes or no in the chat is fine for that. Trauma-informed care is really something that can be a whole separate training in and of itself, talking about the biology of the brain and how trauma affects it. And so this is really going to be a broad overview of what that looks like. So I'm seeing one. Not yet. This is a goal for 2023. Awesome. All right. And then I'm seeing a bunch of yeses, one more no. Yes. All right, Jordan. Yes, many times. I love that. Yeah, I've had it many times as well, but it never stops being impactful to me and getting me to stop and think about it. Okay, so get us minimized here again. All right, so the importance of the trauma-informed care, it creates opportunities to rebuild a survivor's sense of empowerment by prioritizing and restoring the survivor's feelings of safety, choice, and control. It recognizes and addresses the vulnerabilities resulting from the trauma experience, including the physical, social, and emotional impact of trauma. So, kind of summarizing that, basically, you're recognizing the fact that, anyone can have trauma. And for somebody who's been exploited, that can be prior to their exploitation and during their exploitation. And that affects a whole host of things for them. They can have physical issues, social issues, emotional impacts, behavioral. It really affects every facet of their life. And that kind of manifests in how they behave or react in certain ways. And so you may see behaviors or reactions, where you think somebody's just being difficult or combative, or uncooperative. And really what's going on is the effects of trauma. And so I'm actually going to, for a second, I'm going to let Marissa jump in. She has a clinical background. Marissa, can you just kind of give a really quick rundown of the different ways that trauma impacts somebody? And it could be really, just really brief.
Yeah, absolutely. So I currently hold an associate mental health counseling license in the state of Indiana. I will soon be fully licensed. And really what I've learned about trauma, I have, the book knowledge of how the brain changes when someone is exposed to physical trauma, sexual trauma, any impactful event, but I've also seen it, in practice with children and adults. And so something that was reviewed in a work training I was actually at yesterday is the fact that trauma actually rewires the brain. So basically, when our bodies are threatened, you have a fight, flight, freeze, which is more common than people think. We kind of just have to freeze in place and assess the situation, and so your brain is now primed to survive. That may not mean that you are surviving in the best, healthiest way. right? So for people who are addicted to substances, their brain has adapted to that substance so much that now their brain tells them, you need this to survive. You will actually die without it. In some cases, that is true, right? Some withdrawal is fatal, but not all of it, right? So it's more about that dependence on the substance. And with sexual trauma and folks who are in any type of sexual exploitation or forced labor exploitation, we go into that autopilot. You know, if you think about you're driving on the freeway and your body knows what to do, you're not really paying attention to every sign. You're just like, oh, I'm on the highway for 50 miles and my body and my brain knows what to do. People can adapt to traumatic experiences, especially when it's chronic. They just adapt to it because that's how they survive. And we may look at that and be like, oh my goodness, like your survival is actually for you to get out of that situation, right? But maybe they've tried, or maybe they really, that exploitation and that abuse that they've experienced has convinced them they're not as strong as those forces. And so to survive, they just have to comply. Yeah, so that's some general and specific information that I hope is helpful to you. And yeah, if you have any more like questions, please put them in the chat.
Thanks, Marissa. I appreciate you jumping in. Everybody, she did not know I was going to put her on the spot like that. So, but I love getting her input, because the one piece that, I mean, for all of my years of experience working in this field and related fields, I don't have the clinical piece. And so it's really helpful to get her input on that. And she's really great at breaking that down. So, all right, let's see if I can get us to move on here. There we go. All right, so the objectives in trauma-informed care, first and foremost, you're aiming to avoid re-victimization, right? You don't want to cause more harm. You appreciate that the many problem behaviors began as understandable attempts to cope. And so this is really what Marissa was alluding to. You know, the behaviors that you may see are, you know, you're not thinking that's a healthy behavior in the situation that they're in. But that's really, you know, their body's way of adapting and coping in the really difficult circumstances that they're in. It strives to maximize choices for the survivor and control over the healing process. Giving them choices is huge. So somebody who's been through in a trafficking situation has been exploited over a period of time, all of their choices and control is taken away from them. They're told where they can work, you know, what type of work they'll be doing, when they can sleep, when they can eat, if they can eat. Many times they're told to use a different name than their actual name. It can be multiple names. They'll have to change their name over time. And so they have no say over anything. The trafficker completely takes over any and all choices for them. And so when you give them choice, you're giving some of that power and control back to them. And it can be very minor things. It can be, do you want to, are you more comfortable sitting and talking first before we do the exam? Are you cold? Do you need a blanket? Do you need a minute before we talk? Just those may sound like minor things, but somebody giving them that choice is something that they haven't seen, and it really highlights for them the difference between how their trafficker treats them and what a healthy interaction looks like. Seeks to be culturally competent, and that's obviously important in all patient care, whether we're talking about trafficking or not. And then understands each survivor in the context of life experiences and cultural background. And so again, you're thinking about those pieces that may have occurred behind the scenes that got them to this place, and not just surface level that they have these injuries. Okay, so I see somebody said Dr. Rebecca Campbell has some great educational videos on neurobiology of trauma and sexual assault. Yep, definitely. That yeah, that gives you, for the folks interested in how that actually works in the brain, really great to check out those type of resources that break it down for you. All right. And all right, so before I show this particular video, this is put out by Life Story, which is a project that works to elevate voices of survivors, specifically women who have been in sex work. And so there's a number of survivors in this video talking about their, their actual experiences and what happened when they went to the hospital. And so I think it's really important for you all to hear at the same time. You'll see I do have a trigger warning because, some of the accounts are pretty graphic when they're talking about their injuries and how they were treated, and can be upsetting. And so I don't like to spring things like this on people without any warning. So, we definitely want people to feel safe. And if you're feeling uncomfortable or, it's upsetting to you, feel free to just disengage or, mute until it's over. That is completely fine. I have been in this field a number of years now, and I've been to trainings where, even though I've heard stories like these and I've worked with clients who've gone through similar things, when a trainer just puts the information out there without a warning, it can be really hard. So just keep that in mind. And I'm going to actually bring it up here. Marissa, can you just let me know if you can see that on the screen?
I think you need to control click. Right now, I'm just seeing the presentation slide.
Okay, hang on 1 second.
And you may need to share a different window.
Oh, no, there we go. Is it up now?
No.
Okay, so yeah, let me stop sharing and I'll share a different window. Hang on 1 second here.
Yeah, because it probably popped up in like a Google,
an
internet browser. Yeah.
All right, can you see that? Where it says medical emergency?
Yep, we see it.
All right, hopefully the audio will work on this. And again, I'm just going to scroll down here to the bottom really quick because I do want to acknowledge they have the names of survivors and allies that appear in this. And I want to make sure you see that because I want to acknowledge that they, that they put themselves out there to share this. And it's not something I ever want to take for granted. Make sure you can see this as well as possible. Okay, here we go. Oops. And then I'll scroll back up for you.
I don't hear anything, Karen.
Okay, hang on 1 second.
So
let's.
I think if you want to unshare, I have it pulled up and I might be able to share it with audio because there's like a certain button you have to click. Zoom is kind of annoying that way.
Okay.
Let's see.
I'm going to let you pull that up.
Yeah, you have to hit share sound. Okay, let's get this big so people can see it.
And this is why I'm glad I have a team around me to help with things like this. And then you just have to scroll to the bottom for the play. Yeah. It's kind of a large
thing. I found out there were these things called escort services. And I thought that I was like moving up, a step. And it's the same. I mean, it's the same. You're just not getting into somebody's car. You're walking into somebody's house. Or you're walking into a hotel room with a stranger. I mean, they still hurt you.
Everything was fine and dandy until the first time I said no.
A guy woke up, realized I was black. That's what he wanted the night before, but he woke up, realized I was black, and all hell broke loose in the room.
Una de las veces que recuerdo, el hombre me apretó tanto la boca que me rompió los dientes.
He broke my wrist.
I got my hair cut off. Sliced my face. I've had guns put to my head.
Thrown out of cars, beat with a bat, had guns to my head.
And I remember sitting in the hospital, my chest was so heavy and I thought I was having a heart attack and I couldn't breathe.
I was terrified that this man who had just tried to kill me was going to come back and finish the job.
I was definitely afraid of being caught and found out. And if someone had said, I can help you on that day, especially on that day, I would have taken it.
I have this weird relationship with hospitals. Like, I'll go in for surgery because I like that they take care of you, you know? And that's what I appreciated. I will say that the nurses I remember in the emergency room showed kindness and compassion, but nobody asked me anything.
People who work on the front lines, like health professionals, can be such an important time, especially in a medical field. That might be the only time that woman is away from her trafficker.
I think that's definitely a great opportunity for someone to be kind of a first-line identifier. There was a lot of training that went to medical people, social workers in hospitals, to identify, hey, this person might be victim of some type of child abuse or domestic violence. I don't really see much of that on the trafficking side.
When I had my daughter, walked 2 blocks in my socks to get a cab by myself and went to the hospital and so scared. And I remember they asked, would there anybody be coming? And he didn't show up. And then he didn't show up. And I was supposed to be checked out of the hospital like 11. He didn't show up till 5. And I'm just waiting there, have no money. You know, I think that would have been odd.
I had over 18 emergency room visits. I was a child. I was out there. I was walking on the streets. You could tell I looked young. I should have been in school. To them, I was a prostitute. They treated me like I was dirty and that I deserved to have this abuse happen to me.
One time I went to the doctor, and the doctor I went to urgent care. I told him that I was a prostitute and I was scared of what I might have. And he was like, well, you obviously have an STD. And just gave me some medicine, told me to go home. It turns out that I didn't have an STD. I just had like a cyst that bursted.
I had just been almost murdered. Nobody came to talk to me. Nobody. And the X-ray technicians decided to sexually abuse me while I was there. All I could think was this is all I am. I mean, this is how it's going to be for the rest of my life. I mean, I'm looked at as nothing but an object.
Wanting to feel like someone cares about you, someone wants to help you, there's someone there who can and will and wants to take care of you. That's very human. And maybe that's the route. I think it's just trying to make that initial inroad and, the initial kind of identification that's important.
I remember the doctor saying, can I talk to you for a minute? And I was like, yeah. And he asked me, was I under a lot of stress? He asked me, are you going to be okay? I said, yeah, I'll be fine. I think that I'm overworked. And he said, are you sure? I couldn't tell him out of embarrassment. Like, I felt like I was a strong woman. I am a strong woman. He never guided me to any other intervention, but just his words and him knowing was important to me.
Okay, so obviously hard to hear, a lot of that. let me get us back to where we were in here. So Marissa, can you tell me if we're back in the PowerPoint?
Yeah, we are. It's not full screen, but
Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna, there we go. So, you can hear that they had different experiences, when they did go for healthcare services, and, sometimes the interaction that they had, even just somebody asking them, are you okay? And kind of noticing that something was off made all the difference for them. Somebody actually seeing them. I think that's, kind of at the core of trauma-informed care. You're actually seeing somebody, you're recognizing this is a human being who may have struggled with some really hard things, and taking that time to notice. And, I do want to touch on what the last survivor said, that she was too embarrassed to actually tell the doctor. So, trauma-informed care doesn't mean that you're necessarily always going to have a victim who you ask a few questions and then they say, yes, I am being trafficked or I'm being exploited. Again, they don't normally identify as a victim. They still may be afraid. They, still might be feeling shame. But it might be the difference in them coming back over time and getting more care and maybe being identified, at a later point in time, and accepting help at a later point in time. We talk about this with direct service providers a lot. Having an open door. So, and I know that, hospitals do anyway. If somebody has a medical emergency, you don't turn them away because it's the third time that they've been to the emergency department. But when you're seeing people coming in a lot and kind of taking that time to think, okay, what's going on, that so much is happening. They keep having these different injuries, different things going on, and leaving that door open to be able to assist them. Okay. So what that really looks like in a healthcare setting is, thinking about those prejudices, building trust and rapport. So that is over time, it doesn't happen overnight, but how you interact with them, if, they can tell you're kind and you're, you sincerely care about what's going on with them, that actually goes a long way. Go above and beyond in explaining what and why. This is hugely important. Again, this goes along kind of with the control piece, but also the fact that they're subjected to really unpredictable circumstances, and constantly having to have sex with strangers. They never know who they're going to be meeting up with. They never know what's around the next corner, what kind of violence they might be subjected to by a buyer, as well as the person trafficking them. That unpredictability is meant to keep them on their, I think the saying is, their back foot. The trafficker, it's part of the exploitation is kind of built into that, but it's also partly intentional to keep them from never knowing really what's going on or what's going to happen to them next. So taking the time to say, hey, we're, this is the exam we're going to do. This is what it involves. This is why we're doing it. Really giving them that information to be able to make informed decisions. And then, really kind of changing your framework from looking at it as what happened to this person versus what's wrong with them. Kind of really gives you a different lens for how you view the patients. And then it's, being strength-based, culturally sensitive. We talked at the beginning the difference between a victim and a survivor, and using the term survivor because we recognize somebody has survived really difficult circumstances, things you and I may never have to deal with. There, again, the coping mechanisms that Marissa was talking about, that they've developed over time may not be healthy to you and I, but it's what got them this far. And so recognizing that as a strength in them. Okay, so red flag examples in a healthcare setting. These are the things that you're looking for. And we say examples because there's no one set list of red flags where, you can look at one sheet and say, okay, well, I don't see it on here, so it's probably not trafficking. There can be a number of things that set off alarm bells now that you've had this training that don't necessarily see on the list, but it might tip you off to start looking for some other things and could be an indication that trafficking is occurring. So accompanied by someone controlling. If another person brings the patient in and insists on going into the exam room with them and wants to do all the talking for them, that's a big red flag. It could be the trafficker. It could be another individual that's being exploited by the trafficker and is told to go and, keep an eye on things. But the person is not wanting them to answer any questions on their own. You may see behaviors of trauma, so paranoia, anxiety, hypervigilance, inconsistencies in story. This is not necessarily because they're trying to be difficult or tell you lies, but again, because of the way trauma affects the brain, people who are traumatized can't always remember what happened in the way you and I would. So it doesn't come out in a chronological order. It may seem very fragmented, like they're jumping around and the pieces don't quite fit. Suicidal ideation, signs of abuse like numerous injuries, bruises, burns in various stages of healing and maybe never got any treatment previously. Poor dental hygiene, signs of malnutrition, UTIs, STIs. Someone has control over their, their identity documents or their visa. If they're a foreign-born victim, they don't have any control over their own money. Maybe they have a lack of knowledge of where they are. It's very common, especially in sex trafficking, for victims to be moved around a lot. And so they may have no clue where they are. And for foreign-born victims, if they're not familiar with the area and don't really know where they're at, you may see that as well. Evidence of a prolonged infection that could have been treated with a routine checkup, that addiction to drugs or alcohol. And again, that one by itself doesn't necessarily mean trafficking, right? You can have somebody who has an addiction where there's not exploitation. But if you're seeing some of these other things along with it, it's definitely a red flag. Urinary difficulties, pelvic pain, vaginal rectal trauma. That one's really common if somebody is being forced to work in the sex industry. A survivor had me add this last one, a survivor consultant that I worked with. Impacted tampons are present. And they come in because they need tampon removal or condom removal. Multiple abortions, all the talk around, the new abortion law. You may come across victims who have been forced. It's very common for a trafficker to force a sex trafficking victim to have an abortion each time that they get pregnant within doing, being coerced into doing the work that they're having to do. If we're talking about labor trafficking, it could be chronic back pain, hearing problems, vision problems, and having no workman's compensation or insurance. And then this one, if you haven't seen this before, tends to surprise people, but microchip GPS. I meant to actually include the picture of it. I'll have to look for that because we do have a picture, but it generally looks like almost the size of a piece of rice and kind of the same shape. And it could be implanted like in the web of their hand, maybe behind their shoulder, but traffickers do actually use those sometimes. And so it'll look just like a little raised area, a little odd shaped raised area. Okay, and I see one. Okay, and I see Marissa had put another good book recommendation in the chat, What Happened to You, that talks about trauma. Thanks, Marissa. All right, so when you're seeing red flags, you obviously have to know what to do in terms of reporting. So immediate danger, we always tell people call 911. That's still the gold standard if you think there's that immediate danger. If you suspect a minor is being trafficked, it is considered child abuse in the state of Indiana, which means that's a mandated report to the DCS hotline. And it's really important when you call the hotline to say, I suspect human trafficking, to use those words, because they actually have a different process they use for those cases than other child abuse and neglect. And the hotline worker may or may not recognize what it is if you don't use those terms. And then that process won't get followed. If you have reason to believe that an adult is being exploited and is endangered, that's a mandatory call to the Adult Protective Services hotline. And so endangered, if you look at that statute, it kind of has a lengthy description, but basically we're talking about somebody, an adult who's incapacitated. You believe they're incapacitated to take care of themselves or make their own decisions. And then finally, let's say it's neither of those circumstances. Maybe it's an adult who's not, they still have capacity. You don't have that particular concern, but you do suspect that they're being trafficked. You are actually required by state law to provide them with services and resources, information about services and resources, including the telephone number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I actually thought I had a slide in here with the hotline number. So I'm gonna, everyone will get a PDF of this presentation after we're done today. And so I'll make sure that that is added in so you have that in there. But you do have to offer that to an adult that you suspect has been trafficked. They may say, I don't need that. I don't want that. I don't know what you're talking about, but you still do have to offer it. And if you are not aware, there are ICD codes related to human trafficking that were added in 2018 that have to do with suspected labor and sex trafficking, confirmed labor or sex trafficking, and then doing exams and observing a victim of forced labor or sexual exploitation. I actually reached out to a contact at the Indiana Department of Public Health to find out if there's any numbers on whether these codes are being used around the state, and they could kind of collect those to look at what that looks like. And admittedly, I'm not a healthcare provider, so I don't know how that works, but she was going to check on that. I would be interested to know how many healthcare providers are actually aware of the codes and using them. And this is super important, especially the suspected ones, because once you have that in, somebody's record, maybe they're not identified at that point, but they come back in and, the doctor or the nurse looks at their prior record and sees that code in there that tips them off. Okay, we should be on the lookout for that. And then, thank you. Marissa actually put the national hotline in the chat. So it's 888-373-7888. All right, so other super helpful resources specifically for healthcare providers. Heal Trafficking, so Health Education Advocacy and Linkage, is a phenomenal resource. I encourage you to get on their website and then sign up for their listserv. They're constantly putting out, new research in the healthcare field. They have, a number of different trainings that they do. They put out toolkits. They have providers working on this from around the world. So when I need the most current information in the healthcare field related to trafficking, this is usually where I go. So Department of Homeland Security has something called the Blue Campaign, and if you get on their website, you can actually request free human trafficking materials. So that could be posters that you put up in the hospital that, have some red flags where if people, maybe a patient comes in the ED and they're looking at the poster and kind of thinking about what it says, and they see the national hotline on there, they might follow up and call themselves. Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, which I have mentioned a little bit about already. They are statewide. They have regional coordinators throughout the state that provide training to a variety of audiences. So they have a law enforcement specific training that they do in partnership with the Indiana State Police that is just for law enforcement. They have training for educators. They have training specific to youth workers. They have a separate one just in partnership with DCS for DCS staff. So a lot of great information that they put out. And I can actually, when I send the PowerPoint, I can connect you all with the regional coordinator in your area if you need them as a resource. The other thing they do is work with local service providers to get them trained and build capacity to have those resources. So when victims are identified and recovered, there are resources in the local area that can provide assistance. IPATH, which is our state human trafficking task force, and I'll get to that in a second. And then the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. The reason I include this is because they have a lot of great materials on secondary trauma. And I know, again, for people who are in healthcare, first responders, you are coming across traumatic things daily. And that can absolutely have an impact on your own mental health. You can experience secondary trauma, which is essentially you feel the effects of the trauma from what you have witnessed and the things that you have heard. And so, you know, they have training materials, they have awareness materials that can help you become aware of this and how you can take care of yourselves as you're doing this really, really difficult work. Okay. So IPATH, again, is our state human trafficking task force. And you can see we have a lot going on in it. So the task force is co-chaired by our agency along with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. It's been in existence since about 2006, and we have a number of targeted committees. So there's a law enforcement specific one that does training and technical assistance for law enforcement around the state who need it. A labor trafficking committee who has really great resources. They're usually my go-to if I come across a case where it's labor trafficking and resources are needed. They're usually my first call. CAPE committee, which is really our outreach community. They do youth prevention curriculum in schools, and victim services committee. So they have both youth victim service providers and adult victim service providers. We actually had a healthcare specific working group for a while in that committee, and it disbanded mainly because, as you know, healthcare providers are really busy. And so it's been difficult to find healthcare providers that could co-chair that working group and would have time to run the meetings. But healthcare providers are very welcome on this committee. We would love to have you. So if you're interested, definitely let me know. If you're law enforcement and interested in that committee, let me know and I can definitely connect you with them as well. And then you'll see we have a number of regional coalitions around the state who are also members of the task force. I think the Southeastern Indiana Coalition is the one closest to you all. And so if that's something you're interested in, I can provide their contact as well. And then overseeing all of this, in addition to the co-chairs, we have the core committee. So leadership from all these other members filters into the core committee and does the steering. And so that also includes DCS and the Attorney General's office. And we have several survivor leaders on the core committee as well. Then what's next? So now that you've had this training, really thinking about, could we be creating some human trafficking protocol within our hospital or within our agency, depending on where you work? Does your team need more training? If you're law enforcement, does your department need more training? And maybe we can connect you with ITVAP for that. Even if it's not, if you're not a sex crimes prosecutor or on a SART or a sex crimes detective, For patrol officers, they might be the only person who comes across a victim if they're not coming into the hospital, but maybe they're encountering them on the street or in some other situation. They definitely need to know how to identify and who to call for that. And so, figuring out who needs to be at your table to develop that protocol, making sure all staff gets red flags and understands what the protocol is so that it can be followed, and then identifying those community partners. So, maybe there's local service providers that would be really helpful for victim advocacy when you get these cases, and that you can call on when you encounter an adult victim who says, yeah, I want some help. Connecting with Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program when you have questions about services, or they're really great also with connecting stakeholders. So maybe you need to connect with a particular law enforcement partner. We work with and they work with FBI, Department of Homeland Security. They know who all those contacts are. And so if you have questions or need assistance with that, they can definitely get you connected. And then if you're, it's hard to know where to start with a protocol. And so you can even start with some basics, defining, the mandatory reporting requirements. So, again, for children, that's mandatory offering of the National Human Trafficking Hotline to adult victims, planning how you're going to assist someone when they, for adults, just to be very clear, as with any other crime, it's up to them if they want it reported to law enforcement. They may not want to press charges. A few years ago, there was actually, sorry, starting to lose my voice. There was actually a state law that was passed that healthcare providers were required to call law enforcement if they suspected that an adult was being trafficked. And there was a number of organizations that advocated that that be removed because it was a very difficult dynamic it created if, an adult was not ready to leave their trafficking situation yet, did not have any safety plan in place. Calling law enforcement actually put them in harm's way because they were going back to their trafficker, and then the trafficker, would find out that they talked to law enforcement, and we wanted to really avoid that situation. Unlike with youth, when you call the hotline, actually, oh wow, I see the chat is blowing up, so I'm gonna hop in here. All right, let me stop there. I'm going to stop here for a second. I'm just going to look at the chat because I see we have a couple of questions. So if we're looking for a resource to identify CME training for the ED physicians, do you have, and can somebody let me know what CME stands for?
They said continuing medical education.
Got it. Yeah.
It's like a CEU.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can get that through HEAL. I can double check that for you as well, but I'm pretty sure that that's something that they offer. So yeah, thank you for asking that. Okay. So yeah, so that issue of not reporting to law enforcement if the adult doesn't want you to. If we, call DCS for a minor, they can come up with a placement for them. They can do the safety planning. There's really that safety net. That safety net doesn't exist for adult victims. So it really has to be when they're ready and when they, want to make that call. Minimizing trauma to the patient, maximizing patient and staff safety. So helping everybody understand, what they're looking for, who to call. In terms of maximizing patient safety, one, really important thing to do if you suspect they're being trafficked and somebody is with them that's controlling, separating them from that person. It could be saying, we want to give them some privacy in the exam room, or somebody else had the tip of saying, we need a urine sample. So, we're just gonna, I'm gonna take this person into the bathroom for the urine sample. as a means of kind of getting them alone if you have questions. The other great thing about HEAL, and you'll see this in a second, they have a host of tools, including screening tools that help you think through some of these questions. Okay. And then, improving the chances of a successful intervention, really all of the things we just talked about do that. If you're taking that trauma-informed approach, you're really seeing the patient, you're offering them the services when you suspect there's an issue, giving them choice and decision-making power. All of that improves the chances of a successful intervention. And then you can find this on the HEAL website. They have this protocol toolkit to be used in healthcare settings. And so, this is kind of a model to look at and thinking through. I know some, like the National Human Trafficking Hotline had put out a toolkit as well, or just kind of a flow chart for healthcare providers. But the problem was it didn't necessarily take into account like our state law on mandatory reporting of child abuse, or having to offer the national hotline to adult survivors. So when you take a look at this, keep in mind you want to tailor that to our state statutes and what your individual protocols are within your hospital. And definitely talking it over with your legal counsel. I would highly encourage you to get them involved as well. Okay, and so that brings us to the end.